There was a night in Hanover when scorpions had already learned how to make an arena shake. But Klaus Meine walked to the microphone and asked the crowd for something much harder than noise. He asked them for silence. It happened near the end, when the leather was damp with sweat, the amplifiers were humming like tired machines, and Rudolf Schenker still had his guitar hanging low under the white heat of the lights. Matthias Jobs stood a few steps away, Francis Buchholz held the floor in quiet shadow, and Hermann Rarebell waited behind the drums. The audience expected one more anthem. They expected Klaus to lift his arms and send the room into another chorus. But he looked behind him first. He looked at the band. And for a few seconds, the 5 men who had crossed borders, critics, language barriers, American highways, and years of doubt, looked less like rock stars than sons. Klaus said very softly that before the world ever screamed their names, their mothers had whispered them. That line stopped the room. It was not polished. It sounded like something that had been sitting in his chest for years, waiting for the right night to escape. And there, in the same city where the dream had first seemed impossible, scorpions began to call their mothers to the stage. But that gesture did not come from celebration alone. It came from exhaustion. It came from guilt. It came from the strange ache that follows men after they finally get what they thought they wanted. For years, scorpions had been trying to make the world believe that a band from Germany could stand beside the British and American giants of hard rock. They had carried that dream out of Hanover and into small clubs, cold rooms, bad pay, hard stares, and long drives. They had heard the jokes. They had learned that ambition could sound different when it came with a German accent. Their mothers had watched all of it from a distance. They had watched sons leave home with cheap bags and impossible promises. They had watched them miss birthdays, holidays, ordinary Sunday meals, and the family moments that do not look important until they are gone. They heard stories about America, England, Japan, airports, hotel corridors, and the beautiful madness of the road. But they also heard what their sons did not always say. They heard tired voices on late-night phone calls. They heard fear hidden behind confidence. By the time the band returned to Hanover in the mid-'80s, everything looked different from the outside. Love at First Sting had pushed them into a new level of fame. Rock You Like a Hurricane had become a weapon on American radio. Klaus's voice, once threatened by darkness and surgery, was flying over arenas again. Rudolph's belief had started to look less like stubbornness and more like prophecy. The public saw the victory. Their mothers saw the cost. That afternoon, the arena was still mostly empty. Rows of seats disappeared upward into shadow. Road cases sat open. Guitars rested on stands like sleeping animals. Klaus stood near the front edge of the stage. He had seen bigger rooms than this. But home has a different sound when it is empty. Home remembers you before anyone clapped. Rudolph found him there. Hanover was not just another city. It was the place where the dream had been born in small rooms, with cheap equipment, cold winters, and mothers who did not always understand rock and roll, but still worried, still waited, still packed food. Klaus told Rudolph he had been thinking about their mothers. Rudolph smiled at first. Then the smile faded. Because when men who have spent their lives outrunning emotion finally say the word mother, the room changes. It brings you back to the first person who looked at you before you became anything. Klaus said, "We thank everybody except the ones who watched us leave." Rudolph looked out at the empty seats. Maybe he thought of the quiet price families pay when one person in the house decides to belong to the road. Then Rudolph nodded. And once Rudolph nodded, the idea became real. By late afternoon, the plan had moved quietly through the backstage corridors. No big announcement, no television stunt. Just a decision passed between men who were used to hiding tenderness beneath volume. Matthias heard about it while tuning a guitar. He had joined Scorpions when the band needed not only skill, but nerve. Replacing absence is one thing. Becoming family is another. When Klaus told him they wanted the mothers on stage, Matthias looked down at the strings and went still. He did not say no, but the thought unsettled him. Because mothers do not see the stage the way the crowd sees it. A crowd sees lights, power, sweat, danger, glamour. A mother sees the boy inside the man. She sees the son who pretended not to be afraid. She sees how tired he really is. For a band like Scorpions, that was almost more frightening than critics. Herman Rarebill made a joke at first, because that was Herman. He said something about his mother seeing the size of the drums and telling him to play quieter. The others laughed. It helped for a moment. But then the laughter passed and the meaning stayed. Francis Buchholz was quieter. He listened, nodded, and said only that it should be done properly, not quickly, not as a trick. If they were going to bring their mothers into that light, then the light had to mean something. Outside, the fans gathered in denim and leather, the whole machinery of rock moving toward another loud night. And somewhere in that machinery, a small group of women arrived with the modest uncertainty of mothers who had spent decades standing near the edge of their sons' dreams. Some smiled, some looked overwhelmed. One touched the black stage curtain as if it belonged to another world. Backstage, Klaus saw them and felt something tighten in his throat. He had sung in front of thousands. He had fought his way back from the terror of losing his voice. But facing the woman who had known him before the voice, before the stage, before the name Scorpions meant anything outside Hanover, that was different. She did not ask him about America. She looked at him carefully and touched his face for a second, as if checking whether the years had taken too much. Klaus almost laughed. Then he almost cried. He did neither. What they did not know yet was that the hardest part would come after the loudest songs. The concert began like thunder. Rudolph drove the first chords into the room. Matthias answered with bright fire. Francis locked the ground beneath them, and Herman hit the drums as if arguing with fate. Klaus moved across the stage, small in frame but enormous in presence. The audience gave them everything. For a while, the private plan disappeared under the force of the show. But Klaus remembered. Behind the curtain, the first audience of their lives was waiting. Not record executives, not critics, not fans. Mothers. As the final part of the show approached, the band felt the same shift. Rudolph glanced toward Klaus. Matthias looked toward the side of the stage. Herman stopped smiling so much. Francis lowered his eyes. Nobody announced the emotion, but everyone could feel it stepping closer. Then the song ended. The applause rose like a storm. Klaus lifted one hand. Slowly, the storm softened. He knew how to hold a crowd, but this time he was holding them for respect. Thousands of people, many of them men who had come for volume and power, began to understand that something unusual was happening. Klaus said the band had been called many things: loud, German, dangerous, ambitious. But before any of those names, they had been sons. Then he repeated the line from earlier. Before the world ever screamed our names, our mothers whispered them. For a second there was no applause. The words had landed somewhere deeper than applause could reach. Then Klaus turned toward the side of the stage. One by one the mothers appeared. They came slowly, not used to the heat of that light. The band stepped back to make room. Scorpions, the band that had spent years fighting for space in the world, stepped back so their mothers could stand in it. Rudolph's face changed when his mother came near him. The showman vanished for a second. Matthias leaned down and kissed his mother gently. Francis placed an arm around his mother with quiet dignity. Herman, who could make anything look easy, suddenly looked almost shy. And Klaus stood with his mother beside him, the microphone lowered. This was the turning point, though nobody called it that. This quiet line of women standing under arena lights revealed something the band had spent years trying not to show. They had not survived alone. The applause that followed was different from the applause after a guitar solo. It did not sound wild. It sounded grateful. Many in the crowd had come to see heroes. For a few minutes, they saw sons. Klaus raised the microphone again, but his voice was lower now. He told the audience that every band has a beginning people can see, and another beginning people cannot see. The visible beginning is the first rehearsal, the first club, the first poster on a wall. The invisible beginning is a kitchen table, a worried mother, and a door closing behind a young man who spends half his life leaving. That was the truth underneath the lights. Rudolph put one arm around his mother and looked out at the crowd. For years, he had been the man pushing forward. England, America, bigger stages, better songs, one more tour, one more chance. But in that moment, the dream looked less like conquest and more like a long road that had required other people to wait at home. Matthias watched and understood something about belonging. Family in a band is not created only by contracts or photographs. It is created when the private lives around the music are allowed into the room. That night, he was not the new guitarist anymore. He was one of the sons standing under the same light. Then Klaus asked the audience to applaud not for Scorpions, but for every mother who had ever watched a child chase an impossible dream. The sound that came back was enormous. It rolled through the arena like weather. It rose from young fans and old fans, from women who knew what waiting felt like, from fathers thinking of their own mothers, from sons who had not called home enough. For 1 minute, the concert became a confession no one had planned to make. And then something quieter happened. Klaus turned away from the crowd and spoke to his mother without the microphone close enough to catch every word. People saw her hand press against his chest, the place where the voice lived. The same voice that had nearly vanished before blackout. The same voice that had made the world listen. The same voice that had once been nothing more than a child's sound in a Hanover home. Years later, people would remember the famous songs, the leather, the radio, the hurricane, the Moscow wind, and Scorpions as survivors of rock's changing seasons. They would talk about Cold War hope and wind of change. But the people in that room remembered something else, too. They remembered the mothers. They remembered how the band looked smaller beside them, and somehow greater because of it. They remembered that fame did not erase the kitchen table. It did not erase the first worry. It did not erase the fear that a son might go too far from home and never fully return. Before the world ever screamed their names, their mothers had whispered them, and by repeating that truth in front of thousands, Scorpions did something rare. They did not weaken the myth. They deepened it. Rock and roll often teaches men how to look fearless. It gives them volume, lights, leather, smoke, and a crowd shouting their names until loneliness becomes difficult to hear. But mothers hear what crowds miss. They hear the tiredness in a sentence. They hear the boy inside the man. That night, when the mothers finally left the stage, the band did not rush back into noise. They stood for a moment in the quiet space the women had left behind. Then Rudolph struck a gentle chord. Matthias followed. Francis entered softly. Herman touched the drums with restraint. Klaus lifted the microphone, not like a weapon now, but like a memory. The next song did not sound the same. Maybe the notes were familiar, but the room heard it differently. The band had opened a door, and once that door was open, even the loud songs carried tenderness. This is the part people miss when they talk about legacy. Legacy is not only the records that sell or the crowds that come. It is also the moment when a band strong enough to shake an arena becomes humble enough to say thank you. For Scorpions, that night in Hanover lived in the people who saw it. It lived in the mothers who stood under the lights. It lived in the sons who finally understood that every mile away from home had been carried by someone else's love. The world remembers Scorpions for the roar, but for one night, the roar bowed to the whisper. If stories like this remind you why this music still matters, subscribe for more untold stories from the legends who gave everything to the stage.